when Trump first rose was, the Trump 1.0, in 2016. And when he famously said, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and, shoot somebody and not lose a single voter. And this whole idea of only I can save America from this, only I can do this, incredibly narcissistic messianic attitude, which he has. It was so similar to Jim Jones. I mean, people who knew Jones, both as reporters and as former members of People's Temple, were telling me this, that they really heard the voice of Jim Jones in Donald Trump.
Do you have a favorite Messianic cult leader?
Trump, of course, by far, I was writing about, I've been writing about these Messianic cult leaders for, since the 70s, starting really with Jim Jones. And there are a lot of similarities there we can talk about. And so when I started the Substack series, I realized, and I was, writing about, Da Free John, now called Adi Da posthumously, and, others. I thought, I am ignoring the 600-pound Messianic gorilla in the room, right? Which was Donald Trump, right? Because it's happening now. And this was a lot of old stuff that I was putting out there. I did a few posts on Trump, and started thinking about what's going on now with him, and I wrote a lot about back in the 70s and 80s. I wrote a lot about the rise of the religious right, including something they called the shepherding movement, the Pentecostal, spiritual warfare groups, the early Christian nationalist stuff. The people who kind of laid the foundation for what they're now calling the New Apostolic Reformation and the white Christian nationalists. And so I'd written a lot about that, years ago. I hadn't kept up on it so much lately because I left my job as the full-time religion reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle in 2006. That was almost 20 years ago. And my attention has kind of been diverted elsewhere on other books and projects. So I'm just kind of getting back into it now because, frankly, Daniel, I was trying to think when I left the Chronicle in 2006, I was trying to think less about all this stuff, not more, because I was kind of tired of it. But, that's really difficult with Trump. You can't ignore him, and you can't ignore what's going on in the country right now with these groups. So I've kind of been, pulled. So it's like The Godfather. I try to get out, and they're pulling me back into it.
Yeah, of course.
So that's kind of where I am right now. I mean, in a way, I'm kind of trying to retire, but I can't seem to do it. I'm in my 70s, and there's other things I want to do, but there's just so much going on now.
Yeah. So you were full time on the religion beat for like 20 years or something like that?
Yeah, I started Examiner in 1977. And I wasn't the religion reporter. I was just general assignment reporter, but I wound up writing a lot about cults, new religious movements, whatever you want to call them. Like the Moonies, the Hare Krishnas. This was back in the 70s, the so-called, the cult decade, the cult wars, right? Now we have the culture wars, but then we had the cult wars, right? Of the 70s. So I was writing about the Moonies, Unification Church, the Hare Krishnas, and then Jonestown happened. The Reverend Jim Jones, which was a local story, right? He was in San Francisco. And so when that whole thing exploded, in Guyana and South America, the mass murder suicide of more than 900 followers of Jim Jones and People's Temple, that was in November 1978. It was my first year at the Examiner, then I moved to the Chronicle later. But anyway, I did some of those stories about Jones. And that's how one of the reasons I got interested in volunteering to become the full-time religion reporter. Because people forget that Jim Jones was not considered to be some crazy cult leader for much of his, career. He was a very politically connected, progressive, religious leader. He was chairman of the housing authority. The mayor, George Moscone, appointed him head of the housing authority. He was in the White House. He was hanging out in the governor's mansion. I mean, he was a politically connected guy. And so after Jonestown blew up, the editors at the paper thought, well, if we would have had a full-time religion reporter, maybe we would have been more up to speed on what was happening, caught the early warning signs of what was the dark side of Jim Jones, which had actually been reported by my predecessor, a religion reporter at the paper, like 10 years before, and everybody had kind of forgotten about that. Actually, his stories were, some of them were censored because so much political pressure was put on the paper at the time. So anyway, so it was really People's Temple and Jim Jones that kind of got the paper and me thinking about, having a full-time staff person on that beat, which people thought at the time, oh, religion, who cares about religion anymore? That's so 1950s. This is San Francisco. We're so sophisticated. We don't care about, Christians
Yeah.
or and they were really wrong, of course. And so
I-
that's
I- yeah.
how it started.
Let's take a second. I just wanted to welcome everybody. This will eventually go up on YouTube as part of my Liminal News podcast there, and be on Substack. And today I'm joined by Don Lattin, who's an award-winning journalist, the author of 7 books. He was the religion beat reporter for many years, San Francisco Chronicle, and his books include the Harvard Psychedelic Club on Leary, Andrew Weil, Ram Dass, and Houston Smith. Which yeah, I guess that, because I wrote a book on psychedelics that came out in 2002,
Right.
so I remember hearing about your book, but I was already saturated with the whole psychedelic topic at that point, so to be honest with you, I don't think I read it back then. Then you wrote God on Psychedelics, Tripping Across the Rubble of Old-Time Religion, Changing Our Minds, Psychedelic Sacraments, and the New Psychotherapy. Earlier book was Jesus Freaks, A True Story of Murder and Madness on the Evangelical Edge. And you're doing a Substack series on messiahs you have known, or Messianic cult leaders. And yeah, people can also check out your website, www.donlattin with two T's.com. Cool. Yeah, I mean, I thought there'd been, all sorts of overlap between our interests, from kind of like the trajectory of the psychedelic movement to kind of the sort of the cult-like situation of Trump, and the sort of religious fervor that they're trying to engender, the sort of apocalyptic tonality of this whole thing. So we can, I don't know where you want to start with. We can jump in any of those directions.
Yeah, well, we started talking about Jim Jones before, and one of the things that I saw when Trump first rose was the 2026 Trump 1.0, in 2016. Um, when he famously said, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and not lose a single voter. That kind of an attitude, and then this whole idea of only I can save America from this, only I can do this incredibly narcissistic messianic attitude which he has. It was so similar to Jim Jones. I mean, people who knew Jones, both as reporters and as former members of People's Temple, were telling me this, that they really heard the voice of Jim Jones in Donald Trump. And what I found interesting about that was, with Jones, I mean, he was a leftist, right? I mean, he called himself an apostolic socialist, and but his whole thing was only I, Jim Jones, and he often compared himself to like Messiah and claimed to raise the dead and all that. But only Jim Jones could save the left, right, from the CIA and the deep state, the version of the deep state back then, right, and drew his people in that way. Mostly, very very progressive, like social justice type people were drawn into People's Temple. And it was just the exact same thing that Trump was doing, except the politics were reversed. He's a right wing Christian nationalist. It's not apostolic socialism. It's Christian nationalism that he's using to solidify his power. But it was that same messianic narcissistic attitude. And so I did start writing some pieces about that, in the series. And then I've talking to other people, like this guy Steve Hassan, who was a former Mooney Unification Church, who now leads he's like an anti-cult activist and a therapist helping people leave cults, including the cult of Trump. He wrote a book called The Cult of Trump a few years back. He said, remember the first cabinet meetings that we saw, like the first
Yeah.
Trump, when there was this just, this like sickening, like symphony of sympathy, if that's the word. You're right. I mean,
Yeah.
just like the dear leader, right? It was shock. I remember watching that because he televised it. It was shocking, the cabinet's attitude towards him, and it was just like a cult leader, right? And shortly after that, I was talking to Steve. He said he used to be in meetings with Moon. Reverend Sung Young Moon, the Korean evangelist and the leader of the Unification Church in the Moonies, and it was just like that. You dare not question the leader, and
Right. Also the case with North
I
Korea,
mean,
Putin or something.
it was just so there were so many parallels, between sort of the cult Trump, the Trump cult, and some of these other groups that I was writing about back in the.
It does begin to feel like Trump is waning. I mean, he's certainly waxed, and now he's waning. In that, first of all, he just seems like he's, becoming increasingly senile, like he's becoming, kind of, he's reaching some type of
Not reassuring.
What's that?
It's not reassuring in a way, since he has the figure on the button, right? So
He does it, but I mean, it sort of feels like, I mean, like, the Turning Points USA just had a big conference, and it sort of felt like they were really beginning to fight amongst themselves for who becomes takes on the mantle of this movement in a way.
happening. Yeah, that's what happens in cults. Actually, usually when the leader dies, that's when there's all the infighting starts, and the schisms, and it just often falls apart. That's starting to happen with the Trump cults, but it's really the very beginning of it. I'm not sure if it's, who knows what's going to happen. I mean, this movement is also, I think it's more than just Trump. It reflects something that's going on in the culture, right? And you've got JD Vance waiting in the wings. And he's kind of the point guy, with the tech bros, and the Christians. So it's far, even if Trump is losing it, it doesn't really reassure me too much.
Yeah, well, it turns out that many people were very frustrated and almost at the point where they just prefer to destroy the whole American system, whether it hurts them or not. Because a lot of these people we know are voting against their own interests. I mean, the interests of their children. I mean, now we're putting back all these sort of cancer causing, asbestos, pesticides, ammonia back into meat and so on. I mean, the cancer rates are going to, I guess, skyrocket. I mean, so people who cared about their kids, should not have been voting. But there's so many things to talk about. It's sort of interesting. I think maybe one through line a little bit is kind of because you were covering, these kind of like fringe New Age and religious movements and kind of psychedelic spirituality, and how there was like a large kind of wave where a lot of those people, through the Maha RFK kind of channel, got pulled into the sort of Trump world. Was that surprising to you to see so many of the sort of alternative spirituality people and even the psychedelic people suddenly go down this road?
No, it was a bit of a surprise. Although looking back, you can kind of see how it happened. Really, RFK Jr. That was the key thing, right? When he got in bed with Trump, then people followed. So, yeah, it's a fascinating coalition. I mean, it's strange bedfellows, right? I mean, you've got him, you've got the hardcore Christian right people, you've got the sort of the wellness crowd, some of the wellness crowd, with RFK. I mean, even the psychedelic stuff, there's a lot of sympathy to psychedelic therapy among some of these folks too, and so there's that. We bring that thread in as well. I mean, a lot of people, who don't really know what's going on, will say, "Well, I'm afraid that like Donald Trump is going to crack down on psychedelics." I said, I wouldn't. I'm not afraid of that. I mean, actually, it's the whole libertarian sort of arm of not just Trump, but the libertarian arm of the party. And they want to deregulate everything, right? They don't want to have safeguards for anything, including psychedelic drugs. So, in some ways, they're more open to rescheduling or perhaps even legalizing, but certainly rescheduling psychedelics, for therapy, for veterans and other people. So there's all kinds of strange coalitions and bedfellows, happening here. It's an amazing time.
Yeah, it's crazy. Oh, so I mean, it's very scary in terms of the surveillance state and the military state. But yeah, I saw in one of your books you were talking about kind of religion and psychedelics, and even how traditional religions like Christianity are beginning to sort of re-examine psychedelics and try to sort of incorporate them. Do you want to give us any like updates on that? What are you seeing in that?
Well, the last book that I did, which is titled "God on Psychedelics: Tripping Across the Rubble of Old Time Religion," it was published by a small press called Apocryphal Press. Um, and what sort of inspired that was, I've been writing about this so-called psychedelic renaissance, really ever since Harvard Psychedelic Club came out in 2010. And that's when the clinical trials were just really starting to pick up steam, and all that was going on with research into MDMA and psilocybin and all that. So I've been writing about that for a while. And, I've been the religion reporter, so at the paper. And one of the things that always struck me is that it seemed like the psychedelic uh, folks were, more drawn towards shamanism or Eastern religion, and to explain the revelatory experiences they had on psychedelics. Now, part of that is just cultural and what was happening in the 60s, with Leary and Ram Dass and then with, people like Terence McKenna or, Carlos Castaneda, all that stuff, the psychedelic influencers of my generation, the baby boom generation. Um, but I was wondering, why is it that, a lot of these people are brought up as Christians and Jews, why don't they ever look at their own religious tradition? Because there is a mystical tradition in Christianity and Judaism. It just has been very poorly taught by religious leaders of both those faiths. So anyway, I just started looking around for it. When you look for something, you find it. And there were it's just really the beginning of kind of an avant-garde of like Christian clergy and some rabbis who are starting groups that are trying to, bring, so encourage people to integrate and look at the psychedelic experience through their own religious tradition, if they so desire, right? And pointing out that, there is a mystical tradition in Christianity. It's really hidden because a lot of that, like the Gospel of Thomas, for instance, one of which is just as authentic as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but it was not included in the canon for interesting reasons, and so, and then there was the Kabbalah, the Jewish mysticism. So I wrote about some of the groups, and then at the same time, you had the Brazilian ayahuasca churches, and these are like established churches. They're really established denominations. There's two of them, UDV and Santo Daime.
I worked a bunch Santo Daime.
Yeah, and they've both established congregations up here in North America, and they're really the ones they're the only ones who are legally, in terms of the DEA, using psychedelics as part of their religious rituals. They've gotten exemptions, from the DEA, which is not even...
And the Native American Church.
But even, yeah, of course, Native Americans. Yeah, that's right. But I'm talking about the newer groups as part of this renaissance. A lot of people claim that they've, it's quote legal because it's their freedom of religion, but not really. I mean, they can argue that, but they have to argue it in court, right? So anyway, there's a lot. So the book was about bringing together all that and sort of looking at, what can mainline churches learn from the psychedelic renaissance, and vice versa, So it's a little book. It's a thin book, it's based on a series of articles I wrote for Lucid News, which is a psychedelic news website. And I put it together and put out this little book a few years ago. Yeah.
Nice. And you've also written about the value of psychedelics for your own like development and kind of your own personal use. You said it's sort of been more impactful for you on the therapeutic side than the mystical side, I think you said.
Oh, actually kind of both in a way, I mean, I haven't written, well, I never really wrote about that in the past. I'm kind of an old school journalist, where I is a dirty word, write about yourself, and for years, I never wrote about that at all. And I was, hesitant to, because I was the religion reporter at the Chronicle in San Francisco, the main newspaper. People have sort of expectations of what a religion reporter is supposed to be up to. And, taking drugs is not maybe one of them, but especially if they're illegal. So I never wrote about that, when I was still working for the paper. But it was really, first time I wrote about it was Harvard Psychedelic Club, which came out in 2010. And that was a group biography, as you mentioned, of Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, Ram Dass, Houston Smith, Andrew Weil. And at the end, I wrote a little afterward saying, telling the reader, there's another reason why I'm interested in this stuff. And that was basically, a couple of very revelatory and also terrifying experiences with, LSD. As a very young man, as a, freshman at Berkeley in the early 70s.
Yeah, you had the classic melting into your girlfriend at Big Sur experience.
I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but it actually happened, Daniel.
Listen, I had a very important mushroom experience at Big Sur. It's a great place to try.
I'm writing about it. I thought this is sort of cheesy, It sounds like on a cliff at Big Sur, but no, that's what happened. And then I had a very, very bad, very bad, very difficult experience just a few months later, and so that convinced me of both the promise. It showed me both the promise and the pitfalls of psychedelics, and made me kind of cautious for a long, long time. So there was that, and I think I mentioned that Jim Jones was one of the reasons I started writing about religion and spirituality. But another reason was experiences that I had on psychedelics. In the 70s, I got into meditation. I went to Zen retreats. I got into Tai Chi. So I did start and mysticism, and eventually later on some Christian mysticism and exploring that. So I really can link that back to the experiences I had. The first real quote mystical experience, religious experiences I had were on psychedelics. So it did have that had an impact too on why I wound up spending 30 years of my life, as a religion reporter. Most of it writing about mainstream churches, not anything to do with psychedelics or mysticism, but that was part of the reason I got into this.
Totally. I'm curious with Jim Jones and Dofri John and these kind of extremist cults of the 70s. Was there usually like a psychedelic use that sort of triggered something in these guys, or was it all sorts of different ways?
I don't think there was any psychedelic aspect to Jones. It certainly was with Dofri John. Jones, I think, was on a lot of drugs, maybe on speed. I think a lot of his paranoia, at the end was partly due to the drugs he was on, but he wasn't on psychedelics as far as I know. Dofri John, they came up in the late 60s, early 70s. Yeah, started in Southern California, but they were based in Marin County here in the Bay Area. And they went through a period where psychedelics were a big part of what they were doing.
Just one of his followers donated him an island, right, which you visited near Fiji or something.
Yeah, the most sort of this is the first thing I write about in this Messiahs I Have Known series, and it's kind of the story that we never really got told about what happened, but till now. But yeah, what happened was one of his wealthy devotees bought him his own island, a freehold island in Fiji in the South Pacific, where he took off with kind of his inner circle of his top lieutenants and some of his followers, in the 1980s. In a way, it was very similar to what Jones did, going down to South America and establishing a compound down there. So some people thought this could be, quote, another Jonestown, with Dofri John in the 80s. So when he had this ashram.
Yeah. And he was kind of chased out, right, of the U.S. For sexual stuff and so on.
No, he wasn't really. Yeah. No, he wasn't. Jones was chased out,
Because, that's right. Okay, go ahead.
Jones was not so much for sexual stuff, but just for a very abusive practices towards his devotees. But no, so no, Dofri John he wasn't really chased out. He had a guy who bought him this island, and then he was starting to get some negative. Often they get negative media publicity, then they flee. But in his case, they just had this opportunity. Now, what happened there is it was some of his top lieutenants defected and filed a lawsuit in Marin County, claiming that some people were being kept against their will, brainwashed and kept against their will on this island in Fiji, including the former wife of the president of the cult, and sensationally, a former Playboy Playmate of the Month, Miss September 1976. So you had this story that, I was at the Examiner at the time, which had some tabloid tendencies, right? So it was a hard to ignore. You have this sex-crazed guru on his own island, allegedly keeping a Playboy Playmate, one of his 9 wives, captive. So this was such an exciting story that the Examiner sent myself and the photographer all the way to Fiji to look into this. So I tell the whole story about what happened on that trip in the Messiah's Substack series.
Yeah, I've been friends with some of the kids who grew up in that community. Um,
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you know any of his daughters, like Namala Jones? There's two or three daughters from different mothers that are.
yeah,
One of them is seen as a potential, I think maybe successor or something. But there's a power struggle in that group, like there always is when the leader dies. So
yeah. Um, yeah. So I mean, and so what do you kind of maybe extrapolate a little bit on some of the parallels? I mean, somebody was asking. I mean, do you think that somebody was noting in the comments that Mary Trump believes that if they try to take Trump out, he's going to try to take the country down with him, which sounds sort of Jim Jones-esque. But what do you see as kind of the parallels between how Trump operates and how Jones operates? And you feel that we could see something like a apocalyptic scenario here, where if he feels too threatened
I,
or something.
the real answer, Dan, is I don't know, but is that
Yeah,
the but there are the parallels are striking. I'm not saying that it's just like I'm not saying it's another Jonestown. What one of
yeah,
the mistakes a lot of reporters made after Jonestown is every single new religious movement that came along that somebody didn't like was another Jonestown, right? And obviously most of them weren't. I mean, there were a few other later examples of like mass suicide, ritual suicides like Heaven's Gate, and horrific things that happen like Waco. That's another story. But uh, so I'm not saying that the Trump cult. Yeah. Also, I'm not saying everyone who voted for Trump is in this cult. I mean, people vote for Trump for all kinds of reasons. There is a hardcore follower, the MAGA following, right? Which you see at the rallies, or you saw on January 6th, right? And you see now with the top lieutenants, like what always gets me about cults is the most dangerous, usually the inner circle right around the cult leader, not the leader himself. The leader himself always has something going for him. There's some charisma, some message, some maybe even enlightened aspect to this person that draws people, and it's often the people right underneath him. And you sort of see that with the people that are right underneath Trump. Um, and then what tends to happen is that the negative personality traits of the leader sort of are projected onto the followers, whether it's the persecution complex, right, or the demonization of the other, or with all the stuff that Trump is doing, which a lot of cult leaders do, right? It's creating this divisive, us versus them scenario, which is what Trump is constantly doing. He even did it yesterday, Christmas, right? I mean, he put out these very divisive, Christmas messages, pitting half the country against the other half, and then the whole, these very religious Christian messages that the cabinet is putting out, the other leaders in the administration, and it's sort of creating this us versus them aspect, uh, and I find that very, very troubling. Um, what he's going to do if he's really threatened is a great question. I don't really have the answer, but I mean, look what happened last time. I mean, it was a coup to attempt to subvert the will of the people, right? Overturn the election. So I don't know what he could do. It might get down to the point of where does the military go? It's a frightening scenario in some ways. I don't pretend to. I'm not a prophet. I can't see the future, but it's going to be a wild ride. I think one way or the other.
yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, we can go into that a little bit. Obviously, also, as somebody in San Francisco, I guess you've also been paying attention to the tech elite who kind of like put the nail in the coffin by swiveling over to
Yeah,
Trump,
yeah, yeah, a little bit. Yeah,
and then
yeah,
also that group has now absorbed some of this white Christian nationalist apocalyptic theology, like Peter Thiel giving talks on the Antichrist and so on.
yeah, yeah. No, there's this, and then there's JD Vance, who's kind of a bridge between Trump and that what do they call him, the PayPal mafia, like Thiel and Musk and was it Reid Hoffman, David Sachs, these people. I mean, David Sachs, who's like in charge of regulating crypto and AI, uh, yeah, it's interesting. It's sort of similar to what's happening with the Christian right. These kind of strange bedfellows in a way, right? Either the tech people or the Christian people. I mean, a lot of people are. I have more ideas about the Christian side of it, but it's like people say, "Well, how can Christians, be for Trump? I mean, he's, he's a convicted, sex abuser. He's not a religious person, obviously, and a, a, a a lot of that is, I think, that most Christians, even if they're not like in the quote cult, but they, say they're anti-abortion, right, or they're concerned about traditional gender roles or whatever, they see someone who can get the job done. I mean, he's the pagan ruler who can get the job done, and we're going to give him that power. It's like
The King Cyrus analogy.
It gets compared with Netanyahu came right out and said, the Israeli prime minister came right out and said he's the Cyrus, of our generation. So a lot of the people on the Christian right, they have
Steve, yeah.
Trump delivered. Trump delivered. Got them the Supreme Court. So it's really not surprising at the leadership level, right, that they would be for him. And maybe it's the same. You could say the same thing about the tech guys. I mean, they don't want to be regulated, and they want to buy up this and buy up that, and a lot of this is including the media. Oligarchs. It's everyone seems it's disgusting how everyone is falling in line. That sort of surprised me even more than the the Christian right. That
Mm-hmm.
that famous pic. What was it at the inauguration where you had them all lined up? Musk and Bezos and Zuckerberg, and beginning. Yeah.
I mean, Steve Bannon said that Trump's victory was divine providence.
Yeah, he went out in this little. He's given a bunch of interviews. I forget what it was. Yeah, he said something like, "Well, he's not a churchy guy, but we see the hand of God in Donald Trump, or divine providence." And I don't know if Bannon really believes that or not, but I think a lot of people are starting to see it that way. Certain aspects of the Christian evangelical movement. It's not all evangelicals. We can't really paint them all with this broad brush.
So I'd be curious to hear a little bit about. So you had psychedelic experiences like in early '70s, and you covered the scene. You wrote some books about it. What's kind of your perspective on the trajectory of the psychedelic movement? From the '60s through '80s, '90s, now today. Yeah, I'm kind of curious. Do you see them becoming a bigger force in American life? Do you see them playing a certain role? Or do you think that maybe the sort of, mainstream structures are kind of assimilating them, so they just become kind of like maybe therapy tools or helpful for like people to like self-optimize at corporations and stuff like that?
Yeah, I don't know. I found the whole thing more interesting when we were counterculture at some point, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is quite a shift. I mean, one reason a few years ago, and after I really got tired of writing about the like you're hearing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, and a lot of it was around the therapeutic use of psychedelics, which I think is a real thing and it can help people. I think MDMA, with a trained therapist, can help people with, say, PTSD or other drugs, other medicines, whatever you want to call them, sacred medicines like psilocybin mushrooms, or can help people with depression and substance abuse. I think that's true, but what's happened is like what happens in everything in this culture now is the commodification, of psychedelics and the medicalization, uh, which I do find kind of troubling. And I understand the reason that the people leading this, like Rick Doblin, at MAPS, it was a strategy, right? To one of the reasons that they chose, veterans and chose MDMA and PTSD was to help a lot of veterans who struggle with PTSD, but they also knew that that would be a way to get support, from conservatives, and it worked. And it's to me, it always seemed a bit like the so-called medical marijuana, movement, that we had to go through that phase of medicalizing marijuana. Yeah, there were a few, I think, legitimate reasons that marijuana could help you medically, but mostly it was just people who wanted to get high. And, you'd go to you'd get your card from your doctor and go get go get your pot. So I think a lot of it was the psychedelic, lobby was sort of using medicine and therapy in one way, as a road to legalization. And Doblin even said that. One of the things I liked about Rick Doblin was he was honest about it, right? He wasn't pretending to not be for legalization. So, but I don't know, I just got a little, then all this, literally billions of dollars, these venture capital, just comes in, and all these like these ketamine clinics were set up, thinking that the next thing is going to be MDMA and then psilocybin, and then we're going to have this whole industry, this whole medical industry with where only wealthy people could afford to get this therapy. That was one of the many problems with it. So yeah, I profound. I guess to summarize, I have profoundly mixed feelings about the direction in which it was going and is going. And I also just got tired of writing about it. So I was kind of one reason I went back to the writing about the cults and religious movements is I was just tired of writing about psychedelics. I'd done, actually, my first book where I was writing about this was that's about the time your book came out, 2001, 2002. I wrote a book called Following Our Bliss, my first book with HarperCollins, which was how the spiritual ideals of the 60s shape our lives today, was the subtitle. And there's a whole section there on, drugs and psychedelics and all that. So I've been writing about it, as long as you have, maybe. I mean, from the early 2000s. And Harvard Psychedelic Club, and that book did really well. So I kind of wrote another one called Distilled Spirits, another group biography going back a generation with Aldous Huxley, Gerald Heard, and Bill Wilson. Their work with psychedelics in the 50s. Then Changing Our Minds, which was, by the way, a year before Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, but explored a lot of the same area that he did in his book, which did a little better, than mine. But so I've been writing about it a lot, and I was just enough, So I haven't really been. I've been trying to unplug from the whole thing, to tell you the truth. Yeah.
Yeah. I saw that in terms of the cult stuff, you'd also written about OneTaste, Nicole Dedone. Tell me a little bit about your perspective on her and on that community.
That was interesting because I wrote about her. Well, I actually wrote about there was this group called Morehouse. I don't know if you remember them or are familiar with them.
I've heard about them. They were another kind of sex oriented.
OneTaste came out of Morehouse, basically. Yeah. So Morehouse was started by this former rancher salesman named Vic Bronco in Oakland. And it was kind of a free love, human potential, SLE type encounter group movement called Morehouse. They bought a bunch of houses all around the Bay Area. They always painted them purple. So you'd see these bright purple houses, and they would have like seminars, and a lot of it was, part of the whole sexual revolution and all of that, kind of taking like Masters and Johnson to the next level. And they were kind of a funny, kind of seemingly relatively harmless, group that arose in the 60s and 70s. Anyway, so Nicole Dedone came out of that. She started this thing called OneTaste, orgasmic meditation movement. So I wrote about, I'd written about Morehouse years ago, and then I knew some people that were involved with OneTaste. I wasn't into it myself, but so I know quite a bit about it. So I actually did another book, which I can't really talk about too much, which never came out, about some other people. It was a work for hire. But anyway, it never got published, but I did do a chapter on OneTaste and Nicole for that book, and got permission to use some of that material from that project. So I put all that out on Substack. It's a 4-part series about her rise. And now, she's now in prison. I mean, the feds went after her and charged her with, basically coercive labor practices, and convicted her and her CEO. So now she's in jail in Brooklyn awaiting sentencing. She's also published jailhouse memoir. She wrote a book while she's been in jail. And her, that was a movement that really took off, in the early 2000s in San Francisco, during one of the first tech bubbles. all these young people coming in, and they practice this thing called orgasmic meditation, which are these sort of highly ritualized workshops where one partner, somebody you just met, would stroke the clitoris of a woman in a very prescribed way for 15 minutes, and then they would sit and talk about it. And it was sort of looking at orgasm as a tool, like a meditation tool.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, I think, got some good fruit out of that. Actually, I mean, a lot of people, I think, maybe improve their sex lives, or couples were able to communicate better, or I think there was some positive stuff that came out of that. But again, it was the inner circle of people around Didion, the who were living communally, and it got into this very kind of cultic, kind of abusive environment with her, where some of her followers were basically told to go have sex with this guy or that guy, like wealthy donors, and it got pretty dark uh, in the inner circle. Like I said before, that's often where the trouble is. Like people can get a lot out of these self-help movements, but the ones who get really involved and right around the leader, that's often where the problems arise. So that was OneTaste. So there's 4 long pieces in the Substack series about that. So.
But and do you think that it's the correct resolution that spends time in prison? Sometimes I feel like
I don't know. I don't know.
well, sometimes I feel that normal society just doesn't like these types of groups. I mean, if you have consenting adults, yeah, she might have told people to do things, but unless she was like holding a gun to their head or whatever, it was still their decision
Yeah,
to,
yeah.
I mean, NXVM or Nixium, I guess, seems like another, kind of a situation where,
I
um,
yeah. I was actually surprised. I wasn't really following because I had written about it like a few years ago, and I didn't, and so I was just sort of following it like anybody. But I was surprised that she was convicted, because I mean I'd seen worse examples of coercive, labor practices in other groups. So why, it's interesting that the feds went after both these groups, and I don't know if that's part of a trend or not. On the other hand, when I actually started, when I got back looking into it now, updating what I'd done. This was like 5 or 6 years ago that I wrote this material, right? When before the sort of the tide turned and the negative stuff started coming out. I mean, I had warnings about this, about her sort of messianic and tendencies in a way in what I've written. But there's a new book out called Empire of Orgasm by woman Elizabeth Hewitt, who was the Bloomsburg business reporter who actually did the first big expose about OneTaste, and then she just has a book. It's just out, and there is some really dark stuff that went on in there, that I didn't even realize. So, you know, uh, but it is interesting that they went after them.
and what do you think is gonna, what's the destiny now of this kind of like spiritual but not religious movement that, there was like the idea of the age of Aquarius, kind of like people expecting some kind of evolution of consciousness or transformation. And instead it feels like we just have kind of like disintegration almost, and then kind of fundamentalism. I
That's a
mean,
turn around onto you, Dan. You wrote the book, the 2012 book, right? Where
that's true.
be the dawning of another dawning of the age of Aquarius, right, or something like it, the Mayan version. But
Well, I saw it as an opportunity for us to try to make an evolutionary leap, but it feels like we, have not figured out how to do that. And in the time that we had available, to address kind of like the deeper ills of the society and the wealth inequality and the injustice, we've for whatever reasons, and I honestly put a lot of the blame on the liberal establishment and the Democrats also, but we were not able to address the sort of fundamental flaws in the system. And yeah, now it feels like it's sort of gotten out of anybody's control. People were voting out of hate and spite and frustration and wanting to just kind of blow up the institutional structures and so on. And the right, the sort of you know wealthy oligarchs, fossil fuel oligarchs, tech oligarchs were more than happy to have people kind of fall into this trap, where now they've got them sort of like, it's like a Venus flytrap or something, where people are just going to be enclosed by media and ideology, and then surveillance systems and AI manipulation systems and so on. So yeah, I'm very, very, very troubled by the direction at this point.
Yeah. Well, that's the trouble with prophecy. It usually does fail, and it certainly seemed to have in that case. And you asked about the broader kind of spiritual but not religious shift, which is a real historic shift. I mean, I was the full time religion reporter, for most of the 80s and 90s, left in 2006, and every year Gallup would have these surveys, right, on religion in America every year, and it was amazing how slowly things changed, how little things changed, in terms of people's religious affiliation, their ideas, but there, around the time I left, you started to see this real shift, away from affiliation with religious groups, but people who are still maybe believe in God or some higher power. So the whole idea of the spiritual but not religious took hold, which is a real thing. That shift. And I think it's continuing. There's been a few surveys recently showed some people are reconnecting with more conservative or orthodox, with the capital O, groups in Christianity, um, but it's and there's the whole idea of the religious nuns, and I think I might have been the one who coined that, or I'm not sure, but NONES, right, as opposed to NUNS, the religious nuns, as in none of the above, right, NON. Um, I was writing the book I wrote actually in 2002, Following Our Bliss, was all about that. It was about that shift, right, the way which was just getting going then. And I think that's continuing, and I think that's much broader than the New Age, or much broader than the psychedelic. It's not like the psychedelics are changing people's religion. It's like there's this broader shift away from doctrine and dogma and denominationalism towards personal spiritual experience, whether it's through meditation or prayer or fasting or yoga or psychedelics or orgasmic meditation or whatever it is. There's that shift towards a personal spiritual experience and a deinstitutionalization, and that can even be among people that are still very Christian, like Bible study groups, people just getting together, having Bible study groups without, sort of a freelance kind of floating group. So that's, or even like men's groups, women's groups, even the whole recovery movement. There's lots of examples of how people's religious time and energy is diverted into other forms, that you could call spiritual but not religious. So I think that's continuing. Um, so, yeah,
Do you think Christianity is? I mean, the sense one gets from the turning points and the sort of world around Trump is that Christianity is kind of taking off again. But do you think that's kind of an illusion? And actually,
an illusion.
Okay,
The problem is these media silos that we're in. If some people think psychedelics are taking over the world because that's all they read about, because they're in this closed loop of information about psychedelics, or whether it's, or the media is very fascinated, of course, to somebody like Charlie Kirk, especially after he was shot. I mean, they weren't all that interested in him. The mainstream media wasn't writing about him that much till he was assassinated, and he became this martyr. So yeah, I think there are very loud pockets that are getting a lot of attention, but I think I think if you look at the Gallup surveys, which are legitimate statistical surveys of the American population, I think I just saw something about this whole Christmas, religious messages in Christmas with Trump and his people. I think it's like 62% of the country today calls themselves Christian, which is a drop of, like, something, I can't remember the number, something like 10% in the last 15 years, which is a big drop. I mean, like I said, that stuff didn't used to change.
yeah,
A lot of it is generational. the baby boom generation. So many people in the baby boom generation fell away from organized religion, and that happens kind of in every generation, in a way. People come of age and go their own way, but so no, Christianity is not dead by any means. It's a very important aspect of people's life. People forget that there are all kinds of Christians out there who are, not for Donald Trump at all, right? And probably the vast majority of them. But it's the something about these Pentecostal groups. They're very media savvy. The whole TV evangelism thing, they got a lot of attention because they started their own TV networks, right? Back in
Yeah.
the '80s. And one reason they did, which is kind of interesting, is they were locked out of the network. The networks used to have religious programming, and they would only have mainline Protestants and Catholics and Jews, and the
Yeah.
evangelists were locked out. So they started their own their own channel on cable and developed this whole, ecosystem we have now. And so you hear a lot about it. Uh, Especially the more radical groups like the spiritual warfare people and all that that
Yeah.
some of them which turned out to like in the '80s. I wrote a lot about the shepherding movement, which was this group that of Pentecostals who would go into churches and take over members and take over churches, and it was this very secretive cult-like organization. Uh, and the other groups that were talking about spiritual warfare, uh, exorcising the demons of the country. And these are the people who kind of wound up in some of the leaders in Turning Point and in this new Apostolic Reformation. So these kind of extremist Christian groups, they play a long game, a
Yeah.
really going back decades. And so, um, and it just seems like we're just suddenly sort of seeing that now, or some people are just suddenly seeing that now, because Trump has embraced them for obvious political reasons.
There's a book, I think the writer is Sarah Posner. I think I texted you before, Unholy, but she talks about how the sort of Pentecostalists and evangelicals, recognize Trump as one of their own, also partially by his style, which was very similar to the style of kind of like this type of television preaching and so on.
Yeah, well, he's a creation of television,
Yeah.
just like the TV evangelists, Jimmy Swaggart and Baker and Pat Robertson and all those who ran for president, and all those folks. Yeah, you can sort of see in the style for sure. Yeah.
How much do you follow kind of like the apostolic reform movement and these other kind of like movements, the Seven Mountains Mandate, that seem to have become very virulent and are really kind of like steering the country in a certain direction at the moment?
Yeah, I haven't really been following them, in the last 10 or 20 years that much because I got my
Yeah.
attention elsewhere, right? I'm onto psychedelics.
Yeah.
I did write about, a lot of these people did come out of this thing called the shepherding movement. And, well, I think did you have like the Francis Schaeffer? You have like
Yeah.
his,
His son, Frank Schaeffer. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right. So Schaeffer was also one of the leading lights that inspired the shepherding movement people. So it was some of the same people. And one
Yeah.
of the texts I did, I write about this guy, Dennis Peacock, who was one of the shepherding movement leaders in the Bay Area. And he's still, he was a free speech movement, 60 Berkeley radical, who
Mm.
went over like a lot of in the whole Jesus movement, in the late '60s, early '70s. A lot of the counterculture people who found Jesus, and some went off in some very strange directions, including right wing politics, or I wrote a whole book about one, the Children of God. But
Yeah. What's that one again?
so that was the children of. So there was this so-called Jesus people, the Jesus freaks of the late '60s and '70s. There were
Yeah.
many of them were kind of counterculture types, or baby boomers who were maybe into drugs or maybe meditation, and were evangelized into Christianity. And this whole movement, a big part of the evangelical movement, was a campus crusade for Christ, which Turning Point is kind of comes out of, right? There were these evangelized people, and actually often about very positive, like the real image of Jesus, like love and compassion and communal sharing, the Jesus you actually read about, in the gospel stories. So there was this movement, the Jesus movement, which was very big, and so some of the leaders of these groups came out of that. Um, uh, and so Children of God was a very cultish group, now called the Family International. They're still around, but they got a lot of attention because they had a free love. They were conservative evangelical, but they had a free love philosophy. So they would send out young women missionaries, who they called it flirty fishing. They would go out and seduce men and sleep with them and entice them into the group. And that it was an evangelical tactic that they used, which created literally several thousand babies were born from these liaisons. They called them Jesus babies. And the men would often leave. They would they'd hang around for a few weeks and then leave. The women were forbidden to use birth control because that was immoral. So there were a lot of pregnancies. So all these children were born mostly in the early '70s into the '70s. And David Berg, who was the prophet of this group, um, he was a pedophile and a prophet, and he eventually died. But so in what was it, in the '80s? I started writing about this group and about the kids who grew up in this movement, and then at a certain point, left. And there was a very sensational story of a kid who was one of the children born in these liaisons was supposed to take over the movement. He rejected it, became a leader of the defectors, the young adults who were leaving, and then he kind of went off the deep end and decided to murder his mother, who was the leader of the group. And there was a murder suicide. Basically, didn't get the mother, but got her secretary. And so
Mm.
it's a sensational story of this tragic example of this kid who grew up in this group who was involved with this murder suicide, and so it got a lot of attention. And so I wrote a book on the history of this group. They're
Uh,
still around.
are there any stories like that you wish that you could still return to, or is there kind of a subject that's really like still something you would love to delve into much deeper?
Well, part of it is I'm in my 70s and I'm sort of trying to like do some other things with my life. To tell you the truth, just
Mm.
personally, I mean, I got back into Trump because you just can't ignore it. It's too important, and as a journalist, it's just such. But even there, I mean, I'm doing some writing, but I'm really trying to get into do I'm interested in this whole, what's happening with religion and AI and this whole idea of
Yeah,
cult of one, some type of this cult of one, like your chat buddy becoming your guru, and how
yeah.
that's play out. I mean, I think people like you are more, following that, hopefully, or other people. But just personally, I'm actually, I got some other things I'm trying to do with my life,
Mhm.
still can. So, uh,
Makes
I, so I'm not really planning another book or anything, but who knows? I say that every time, and then I wind up
mm,
with, yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah, maybe we'll stop there for today. But it was great to connect with you, and yeah, appreciate hearing about your long storied career. And this ultimately will go up on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And yeah, we'll stay in touch, Don, and maybe we'll do this another time. Maybe we've also been experimenting with some kind of like trialogue formats. If there's like a third person who has a whole nother angle,
Good.
sometimes that's for.
Yeah.
In fact, I'd love to do something with Steve Hassan. Maybe you can send me his contact info or connect
That's
us.
really, he's an activist. I mean, he's a little. When I wrote about when I was a journalist writing in the mainstream media about new religious movements, when I wouldn't use the word cult as much as I do now because it is kind of derogatory, but it's a word I refuse to give up on. but but anyway, there's two camps. There's the academic kind of apologists that study cults, and they don't really care about the beliefs or the abusive practices. They're interested in, how they evolve and all of that. And then there are other people, I call them the alarmists,
Yeah.
who every cult is bad, every new religious movement is bad, everything's another Jonestown. I mean, so Steve is more toward, not that he's an alarmist, but he's really part of the anti-cult activism.
Yeah.
I
Well, he
always,
was in a bad one, so that makes sense.
but like somebody say, what's a cult? It's somebody else's religion, right? But all religions start as sects or cults. I mean, Christianity started as a Jewish sect.
Or,
Mormons, started as sort of a cult around Joseph Smith and became like a major world religion with 10 million followers. They're the only cult that made it in America. So
yeah.
so I always tried to sort of talk to both sides, right? As we used to do, right? Talk to both sides, and because you have to talk to the current members and understand what attracts them and what they're getting out of this. And often there's a lot that they're getting out of these groups. Even Trump, perhaps. That's hard to see there, but Steve is great. Steve is a great person to talk to about how to. You mentioned this. We might talk about, like, how do you talk to people in the Trump cult? How do you convince them to leave? How do you convince them to see the light? And he's really good on that because he's a therapist too. He
Yeah.
does therapy with people leaving these groups. And one of the points he makes is you don't argue with them. You listen to them. You're curious. You don't condemn them. You try to just have a conversation, whether they're family members, who are in it, or whatever. It's the same whether it's the Trump cult or the Unification Church. So he would be a good person to have on, to talk about that for sure.
I would love that. I would love that. Okay, Don, thank you. Great to chat. Have a beautiful Californian day, and enjoy the rest of Boxer Day out there.
Okay. Thank you.